Hi everybody. In this video, we're going to start looking at how to model out this interior section for the top of our object. So we've got this chest, we've got this bottom section kind of figured out, but now we've got to deal with the top. So what do we want to do here? Well, first off, there's a couple pieces here that don't quite work and aren't really doing what we want them to do. So let's just Alt-Q will allow us to isolate this object and see some of the shape that we're working with here. Well, we know that this needs to kind of pop in a bit. So let's just select this whole section here. Now you may want to be able to select just this section here, but you don't want to necessarily select this exterior section or any of this other stuff. You could hold Control and try to select, but it doesn't really work. So a little trick you can use is hold Alt, which will allow you to kind of select or deselect things. Now that I'm holding Alt, it'll allow me to create sort of a larger selection here, but then I can let go of Alt and then hold Control. So I'm just sort of swapping my keys here. So I'm no longer holding Alt, I'm holding Control, and then just let go of my mouse, and I've got the selection that I needed. The reason that we do this is just so you can get a actual marquee selection, so you can select multiple things at once. So now that that's done, we can actually just extrude this in. Let's just go in this direction, and we can just taper this in both directions. Doesn't need to be perfect, it just needs to look good from afar, because this is a relatively simple prop. In fact, in most cases, we may not see too much of this, given the angle that we have. This bottom section is probably what's going to be most important, not necessarily this section. So that's pretty good. Not really going to get in the way too much. We can kind of come out of isolation mode just to make sure that this does look compelling. And there's a few things that we can see here. First off, some of these shapes don't quite work well. So for example, this section here clearly needs to be pulled in quite a bit more. And we do want to auto smooth that as well as this section here, which looks like it's just not quite getting the kind of shading that we want. Let's try that again with a lower sort of auto smooth threshold. This is really useful to use in many cases because that lower threshold can just kind of quickly block in some of the shapes that you want. And this piece as well, let's just toss on that symmetry modifier. There we go, that's going to work well for us there. Now this piece may go just a little bit too far in this case. We do want to line that up with this interior section here so that that's going to look appropriate when these pieces go together. That works out pretty good. We could, of course, as well start to extrude this whole section. Let's just, again, hold Alt, and then I'm letting go of Alt and holding Control just to kind of select all these pieces. Sometimes you're going to select stuff you don't want. That's perfectly fine. Let's just deselect it. There we go. That gives me what I want. And I'm just going to extrude and pull this in a little bit as well, just to give a little bit more shape to that interior section, so that it looks like it's got some proper heft to it. And this section here, let's just kind of pull that all in as well, because I think that'll look a little bit better here for what we're trying to build. That's pretty decent. Now, if you wanted to get rid of this interior stuff, these extra lines here, there's a few ways that we can do that. I mean, the easiest way is we just kind of drag these pieces together, and you'll see this information kind of just go away. Now, that may not work in many situations, but in a lot of cases, this will work just fine for us. If we just kind of flatten that out, we could kind of just pull this over. Now, what works well here is the fact that, for one, this top section is covered up. So any kind of weirdness that we might have showing up in the design here, we can't see. So it's perfectly fine to leave it and just basically ignore it. Now, if we wanted to fix this section down here, again, it's not particularly important because there's not much going on there. So all of this stays perfectly fine for us to just kind of leave and not worry about. If you can't see it, don't worry about it too much. So let's just take this section, let's pull this up a little bit as well, just give a little bit more heft to the size of this that we're working with. And we can start even thinking about how some of this stuff works as well. So like, let's take some of these selections here, maybe see if they work a little bit better pulled out. And I would say that they don't. So let's just leave them where they are. Let them kind of connect in a simpler way. So that works pretty decent. And now we can, of course, just test out how this looks from afar. Just kind of pull that down, open it up. And that looks pretty convincing, pretty interesting already. So let's just adjust some of our proportions here. Some of these things don't look quite right. And a lot of times this is the bulk of the work that you have to do when you're working with these kinds of pieces here, is just modifying some of these proportions to make sure that they look appropriate and look even with one another. Because you don't have something built for you, you got to make sure that what you're creating is the best possible piece of what you can work with. Now I'm actually just flattening this as well, as you can see, because this is a 90-degree angle, which is why it's good to keep your snaps on when you rotate and try to design like this. I've got something that I can work with there that'll snap to the world nice and easily. Now for this piece as well, let's just make sure that this goes in properly so that it looks nice and flush with the rest of this shape, depending on where we want it to stay flush with. I think that is probably the best kind of shape for it, because I don't want it to take up too much visual space here, but just be a little bit of an accent there and something that reads well when this closes. And so that we can also see like how that shape works when it closes. Does that look appropriate? And that's pretty darn good. And that basically just gives us some of that structure there. Now, the next thing that we might want to do is start to block in what some of this interior piece could be in a bit more detail. So one of the things we can do is just start to block in just a few extra little details. So because this thing is supposed to be gilded and be really interesting on the inside, let's just start to add some of those things. So let's use Auto Grid and pull in a few extra details here. Let's make a little piece of gold. Maybe pull this thing up. Something that kind of connects to that hinge a little bit more. Pull that out a little bit more. Just connect like that. That'll work nicely. Squeeze it in just a little bit to just create a little bit more contrast. And again, we could duplicate this over or use our symmetries, or in this case, for example, let's just attach it to this piece here. Actually, not that one. Let's attach it to, what would be more appropriate in this case? Let's attach it to the bottom section here. Let's just attach that in here. Now it's going to ask if we want to adjust our material IDs. Let's just say OK to this. Basically just means it's not going to change our material ID. So now our snaps will kind of duplicate that over, which will work great for us. Next we want to do one more thing here, which I think is really, really useful, which is just create a loop here. And depending on where we're selecting, we can just go in here to create shape from selection. So we're going to create a shape, in this case linear, from the edge selection that we've created here. And what we can then do is when we select that, we can use what's called sweep. It's a great modifier, which will basically just create a shape, sort of an extruded shape on top of our specific model shape. So what you can see here is we've got a whole bunch of different options here. Bar is what we're going to use, and we can adjust the angle of this, for example, so that it stays nice and clean. Let's just drop down a new material here. And then we can just start to kind of push this in a little bit, and we can change our proportions, which is really, really helpful. So we could squeeze this in a little bit, maybe push this up. We could add some rounded corners to it. This is our high poly model, so the exact dimensions of this aren't particularly important. We could use a symmetry to maybe create a little bit of an interesting shape there. This is a spline mesh, so there's lots we can do with it. Let's say maybe just take that right here to something like this. That shape still becomes pretty cool to look at, so that'll work pretty decently. Let's go top, see if anything's out of alignment. And it's not, so that's good. So this creates a pretty good shape for us, something kind of gilded on the inside of this to kind of act as a more interesting little embellishment when this whole thing opens. And we do want to kind of pull this piece maybe above that. Just kind of pull that on top, because I think that'll look a little bit better when they go together like that. That's pretty decent. And let's just do the same thing for this top section as well, because that'll be useful for us to work with. Now, we could do it in lots of different ways. Let's just try grabbing this whole section by itself and just kind of repeat this interior piece. And let's go create shape from selection. Let's do linear, because you'll get a few extra edges if you don't. Let's just double click a few times. There you go. And let's repeat this option. So let's just go back down here, and we can go to our sweep and we can say copy, and then click again. There we go. And paste. In this case, we get the shape that we already had. I'm going to go down here, and there's a few extra edges that this created that I don't really want. So let's just get rid of them because honestly, we don't need them. And some of it might be creating a few little errors that we don't really want here. So we can just kind of pull these over. There we go. That way I can drop down a symmetry modifier on top of this as well. Let's just see that we're getting the right, oh, we got to do this on top of the sweep. And there we go. That's the shape that we want with the kind of material that we want. And its proportions are the same size as what's underneath here. And now this one, again, we can just drag into that hinge so that when this closes, that goes with it. And because it happens to be slightly inside of this piece, it'll actually kind of look like they go together. But honestly, from far away, when this thing opens real quick, you're not going to know whether that's doing that or not. So not super important in that case. Just the visual impression that we give right away, that's the important part for what we're working with here. In our next video, what we're going to do is start refining some of our smaller details and getting this to be a bit more of a fully complete kind of model to work with for export into ZBrush.